Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 20. Today we'll hear from Shaunt Oungoulian from Lunes and Populis wines. Shaunt and Diego started in the tradition of the French vignerons with who they trained, leasing and farming many of their vineyard sources and using a very light touch in the winery. Both graduated from UC Davis. We talk about that, as well as how they find their vineyards, working in France, some unusual techniques for less extracted wines, their new winery, and how they pass on some of the knowledge they've gained. Here we go.
Yeah, I think we're looking probably about 2 weeks, maybe potentially more. I think it depends on the varieties and the regions and stuff too. It kind of like last year was a little bifurcated also.
Okay.
Because the spring last year was very dry. Like it didn't really, there was all that rain. No, not last year, the year before. So, I still think of it as last year until it's this year, I guess.
Yeah.
But it rained a bunch in October, November, and December, and then like January to March, it was totally dry.
Right. It was like the first year in recorded history around here that there was no rain in January.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And so that was a bit warmer. And so kind of early stuff like, white varieties or in Lodi or regions like that are earlier, they kind of came out early. And then there was actually this frost, I think it was in May or April, that hit a lot of people, especially in the foothills, but a little bit in Sonoma too. Mm-hmm. And then it got cold. So then stuff that hadn't broken bud yet then got pushed back later. So it was almost like these two, it was like, again, it was almost bifurcated in a way. Like stuff that was early, stuff that was late was very late. And we saw that particularly also then kind of with regions too, like Mendocino, usually a little bit later, we get later varieties. And that stuff was like not, wanting to get ripe, Okay. And so the harvest was almost like some of the early stuff was on time. And then there was like a little window in the middle.
Was the window nice, or did it just stretch things out to even even more months for you?
I mean, it was good for sure. I mean, especially us in the new place is like, I remember there was a moment where, we have our vineyards and we're like looking at our tanks and, we have the whiteboard with like what's going where. And we're like, oh man, we're going to have to press all these tanks, like work overnight, whatever, bring these grapes in. And then we went to go check them again. And we're like, oh, the sugars haven't moved and the flavors haven't really changed. So like we need to stop picking. So we had like a week or so, we just kind of halted bringing in fruit, which is then that's good. The more we can wait, I think the longer the grapes can hang. Ideally we want the grapes to be out there as long as they can be while still having the right balance, and that's mostly like maintaining acidity is a big thing, not having too high alcohol. And so, yeah, that was good in terms of us, especially in the new space, getting clear tanks out and then taking a pause. But I mean, it does run you a little ragged. And my wife, I kept being like, it's like 1 more week, like 2 more weeks, we're going to be done picking. She's like, didn't you say that last month, But yeah, it ended up all right. But I think this year is going to be a little more just everything is kind of shifted because there wasn't that odd spring. I mean, it was odd because it was so wet and cold, but it wasn't kind of split like the year before. And then that's really good too, in that the vines are a lot healthier and there's a much higher crop load also. So that will also kind of delay things.
Push it back.
Yeah, more like 2018 or 19.
Okay.
Were kind of wetter, cooler vintages in the winter beforehand.
Yeah, I think 18, a lot of people were able to just kind of let stuff hang for a long time. It seemed like without sugars weren't really going up and acids weren't really dropping. They just let it ride.
Yeah, totally.
A little bit.
Totally. And then those are vintages. I mean, we started our first real year was 2014. And so 14, 15 were real kind of hot, dry years. 16 to an extent, but wasn't as much, but still was, I'd call it like a drought year. And then 17 was also pretty dry. And there was a big heat wave in the end of August or so.
Yeah, I was going to say like Labor Day, maybe.
Yeah, which is pretty typical. But yeah, 18 and 19, we didn't have those heat waves. And that was like, we talked to the growers we work with up in Mendocino, and they're like, oh yeah, this is normal.
Okay.
You know, when they've been growing for 50 years, it's like, this is what I'm used to, not, you know, people picking in early September. It's like we wouldn't even start until October, basically, you know, with Carignan or Cabernet or Petit Syrah or whatever up in Mendocino County. Yeah, it was nice those years. 20 was heat wave, smoke, everything not good. And then 21 also just like very dry, more heat. But then 22 is kind of, again, a little wetter and still, yeah, very low crop. So it went very fast also.
Okay.
But then this year shaping up to be, it's going to be, you know, you're almost like, is stuff going to get ripe? Like, which is something I've never even really, I felt like needed to ask myself, you know? You saw little glimmers of it last year. But I don't know. We'll see, I guess.
Okay.
You know?
Well, yeah, you work a lot in Mendocino.
Yeah.
Are those longer, is that cooler climate something you enjoy? What drew you to Mendocino?
Yeah. So we started working there, I guess to step back a little bit, my partner Diego and I, we met at Davis together, studying in the viticulture and enology program. There was a good group of folks that were kind of like-minded and getting into natural wines at the time. So it was a cool way to get into natural wines was through the lens of like the Davis education, where it was like, you could talk to your professors. You're like, well, if you don't add sulfur, you don't do this, you don't inoculate, like what are all the different things that come? And, you know, I think the cool thing, a lot of people are like, oh, Davis have this idea, it teaches you something or another, and it most assuredly can, but no one ever told me like, this is how you need to make wine.
Okay.
You know, it was more like a lot of the folks, they're into wine because they're fascinated about flavor chemistry or microbiology or other processes, other academic pursuits that wine happened to be like the way that they approached these questions. You know, so I'd say they were scientists more than, you know, wine professionals and things like that, which is cool, you know. So it's a very theoretical education, and then it's up to you to kind of decide how you want to approach it, you know. And so it's like we learn all this stuff not to manipulate, but to take yourself out of the question.
Yeah.
So then, you know, graduated, and I knew that I wanted to move to Europe for a couple of years because I was into, you know, lower intervention, kind of these very traditional wines. You know, I was Georgian stuff, you know, Northern Italian, Jura, you know, kind of the things that in, you know, the early 2010s were unknown. It felt like at the time. Exotic. Yeah. And so it was like, well, I got this great technical like education. Now let's go get some like practical experience, you know, working with folks like this. So moved there. Diego also moved there. He, through his family, has Spanish citizenship. So he was working at a place, and we were kind of there, not together, but in parallel. Like he was in Chinon, I was in Anjou, and we'd meet up on the weekends and go visit, you know, we'd look up wine terroirs and then like find the phone number at the end and then call them with our pay-as-you-go cell phone and broken French, be like, hey, can we come visit you? And they're like, sure, you know. So we'd go visit everyone that we could in that region, just tasting and stuff. And so fast forward a couple years, we both came back to California. Diego, he's originally grew up just outside of Modesto in Escalon, like in the Central Valley. And his family has some, you know, grape growing in the history there. And we were kind of interested in making wine, and we realized that if we kind of teamed up, we could try and, you know, do more together. And having worked in France, we worked with people that they grew the grapes, they made the wine, the vigneron, you know. And we didn't see that really happening on the smaller scale in California, and especially in the natural wine scene at the time.
Yeah, that was something I wanted to ask you. You guys got into growing your own grapes and farming really early on in both your careers, but also kind of the California natural wine scene of that time.
Totally. And I mean, again, the folks that we worked for, you know, I worked with this guy, Philippe Valette in Macon. And then after that, a bit with Julie Balleny. The late Julie Balleny just passed, but, and they were like, I don't buy grapes, you know. I grow the grapes. And then Diego was working for this guy, Didier Barral, who is, I mean, down in the south of France, I think his father started the domain Leon Barral.
Okay.
And they're just these like fiercely wild, like intense wines that are expressive of the place and the guy also, because he like uses cows and bulls and pigs like in the vines to practically prune the vines. And, you know, half the time Diego's there was more like doing animal husbandry than any winemaking or even grape growing to an extent. And, you know, you could just see, you know, you taste the wine, and if you know the person and you know their process, you can see so clearly that connection. And I think we were just really drawn to that because we both had experience in the wine industry also prior to Davis even. And, you know, it's like you're at the winery and grapes show up on a truck, and then it's great. And you know, places we were making great wines and stuff, but not having that connection like we had working with these folks in France. And so we wanted to get that going, but that proved very challenging in that we talked to people who had vineyards and they're like, cool, like, where's your tractor? Where are your references? Do you have a crew? And we're like, no. I lived in France for a couple of years. Like, I know how to do this. Like, don't worry. I went to Davis. And they're like, yeah, no. Like, and so, you know, we could only find someone with a couple hundred vines in their backyard in Petaluma to get started that first year.
That's a start.
That's a start, you know, because then that gets you a reference and you can tell someone you farm a vineyard, you know, whatever. But in the course of looking for vineyards to farm, Diego got in touch with some of these growers up in Mendocino County. Particularly, I think the first one probably was this guy, Larry Venturi, up near Ukiah. So that's on the 101 corridor. The 101 actually bifurcated his family's ranch.
Oh, did it?
Back when they built it. You know, which
family's not alone.
Yeah. So it's funny because we
probably
have
hundreds of others.
Yeah, we have, you know, parcels that literally like right next to the freeway and stuff. And you can see them when you're driving. And, you know, these like folks like Larry or, you know, the Poor family in Hopland, you know, they grow grapes. They don't make wine and they sell grapes. Like, that's their living. And so there's no chance that we'd ever be able to lease these vines or rent them or farm them ourselves while they still own the land and work the vines. So, but we're like, man, a lot of these vines like are planted in the 40s, some even earlier. And it was cool talking with them because again, we worked in France and you know, I think we're trying to bring, I don't know, some of that at the time, right, to this day still, like some of the culture, you know, the attention to detail, the attention to like every facet of the process. But a lot of the individual things don't necessarily work because out there it's like it's very cold and wet. Here it's very hot and dry. So it's almost like we have the opposite problems. You know, there you're constantly struggling. How do I get rid of the weeds because they keep growing? Here we're like, how do we keep the weeds alive because they keep the soil living? You know, and you know, trying to do things like that. And so when we met folks like Larry or, you know, John and Susan Poor, who, again, literally their family's been farming there for 100 years before drip irrigation was invented, before Roundup was invented, you know, all this stuff. It's like, oh, you guys are doing a really like truly California viticulture, you know, since like almost as early as vines have been planted here. And so it was cool to be able to work with them work with them by buying grapes, I should say, to develop this relationship, to be able to talk shop, like, oh, what do you guys do here? How do you do this? You know, let's see your process, and then be able to adapt it to then our grape growing, like aspect of what we're doing.
Yeah. That's awesome. You get it kind of passed down through the generations.
Yeah.
What's worked and what hasn't.
Totally. Which it's been really interesting and has informed a lot of what we do in terms of, you know, especially dry farming, really not spraying very much, being a little more laissez-faire with like canopy management and things like that is cool. Because I think, not to get too aside, I mean, you know, modern California winemaking, you know, with the points and big, powerful wines and everything, like, a lot of that is done in the cellar, but the advancements of viticulture have also like really
they've kind of allowed it to happen.
Allowed it
in some
and have
ways,
developed in such a way that play a big role on it. I mean, there's a lot of precision viticulture happening. And so, for instance, like people will not plant to drought tolerant rootstocks because they want to be able to use irrigation to create water deficits early in the season, because that will decrease like the amount of pyrazines and other green flavors.
Okay.
So they can really kind of dial that stuff in. You know, you look at the area of the canopy versus the number of clusters you have, again, to increase like fruitiness in the wines and other things. And, you know, so not only has winemaking changed in a more modern way to make these really more modern wines, like the grape growing has as well. And so again, it's cool to look back to what these folks are doing, you know, a lot of it on necessity, because, you know, they're not getting $30,000 a ton for their Cabernet.
Sure.
So you can't afford to position every leaf perfectly, but it does make it for a different style of wine too. And so, you know, we living here, you know, we live in the Bay Area, but we farm grapes in mostly Sonoma because it's basically the closest growing region.
Sure.
But it's cool for us to be able to do this more kind of, I don't know, almost old school style of farming, to make these more old school style of wines from Sonoma and to a lesser extent Napa. You know, it's not just let me pick it early versus later. It's like, let's actually not position the shoots as much so they're more shaded. Let's not pull leaves. Let's not till as much. Let's leave more grass on the ground and things like that. And that will affect the grapes, you know, themselves.
Just kind of looking backwards towards
a
couple generations.
Yeah.
Previous.
I mean, maybe not even that far, you know, looking at probably what viticulture was like when the Judgment of Paris and stuff like that happened, you know, even, 50 years. I mean, I guess that's a couple generations at this point. So
yeah. How many acres are you guys farming currently?
Currently is always an interesting question. I mean, we're always on the look for stuff, and then things kind of go up and down. But we're at about like probably 45 acres of vineyards that we farm.
Okay.
Yeah. Across probably 10-ish vineyard sites. A number of them are right next to each other, which is helpful. And then we try and keep them relatively clustered. So we're mostly in like just in the city of Sonoma, right around that area. There's probably, I don't know, half our vineyards are there. We have one vineyard in Napa, a couple small vineyards in Bennett Valley, and then one larger vineyard in like Occidental kind of Sonoma coast.
So that's the furthest one that you farm then?
Yeah.
Farm yourself.
Yeah. And that one, it's big enough that it made sense. And it's just really interesting. It's like planted in the late 70s Chardonnay on this kind of historic site that's dry farmed and not tilled and surrounded by redwood trees. And we're just like,
very nice.
Okay, we can't not do this. Like it's this kind of older woman owns it. She doesn't have any heirs, and it's in a land trust. And we got a hold of the guy who managed the land trust, reached out to us and was interested in like the type of arrangement that we do. Cause a lot of what we do is, you know, we lease land that we farm. So we don't own any of the vineyards. And basically the way we do it, it works out like, you know, if someone has a vineyard and they don't make wine or they don't grow grapes, then we can offer a pretty good deal. You know, if someone makes grape or makes wine, like they're probably going to want to keep it or pay someone to farm it. Sure. If someone can do some of the farming themselves, then you can kind of actually make some money if you don't, you know, if you already have the land or something. And so with us, it's kind of like someone bought a house or has a house or used to do it, but now maybe is retired or something. And they hire a vineyard manager that ends up costing more than the grapes are worth. And so they're breaking even on a good year, you know? And so we're like, hey, we'll give you a % of the value of the grapes. You'll be in the black every year. You know, it works for you. It works for us. You don't have to worry about the stress of anything. And we'll take care of, you know, the farming. You know, you don't have to worry about selling it. Like it's all good.
Yeah.
And so, you know, again, it's not everywhere, and it tends to be some of these smaller parcels, like 2 to 4 acres. But if we can kind of string them together where you can even just drive the tractor on the street, it works out, you know.
Sure.
You got the best waves from motorists and other, people jogging and walking when you're driving the tractor down the street, and everyone's like, hey, and you're just like, hey. It's pretty fun.
Have you had to convert a lot of those vineyards to your style of farming? What kind of shape were they in, I guess, before you sort of took over the farming?
Yeah, it's been varying shape. I'm trying to think. I would say most all of them were conventionally farmed. And nothing crazy. I mean, they generally sprayed Roundup, and maybe did some systemic stuff, but generally not. People would, yes and no, it kind of depended.
Sure.
But, that would be the main thing. And so, there usually is a kind of a period of transition. So we have like a little knife that runs under the vines, try to cultivate the soil under the vines to kind of oxidize any of the residual Roundup and stuff like that. Okay. And then get that moving towards the organic production, or, we start as soon as we do, but that helps to kind of expedite things and get rid of the kind of trace conventional products that are still there. Yeah.
Okay. Some were probably a little neglected, and others were probably farmed by others up until the day you kind of took over.
Yeah. I mean, I think, none were completely like abandoned,
Sure.
I think generally kind of what would happen was, someone's farming it. Again, they're not selling the grapes, or they're not making money, and they're kind of like, talk to the farmer like, hey, I can't pay you this much money. So then they'll do, maybe not sucker as much, or not put the compost down, and so, or do other things that are kind of, you need to continually invest in for the long-term health of the vineyard. And that's stuff that then we can, we do, and so it's not like, I don't know, neglected isn't the right word. It's just maybe trying to get by, and you can do that for some amount of time until it starts catching up to you, and a few of the vineyards that it kind of was, one of the early vineyards is this Merlot vineyard in Napa. We lease it from a woman whose husband, he planted it in the late 80s, but he passed away probably like, I want to say early 2010s or so. And we started farming it in 17. And so, she had someone taking care of it. And actually we got to know it because we work with a farm labor contractor. So they'll help with harvest and other kind of high like labor demand times of the year.
Sure.
And, he kind of knew what we were doing, and he was like, hey, you should talk to this lady. I think she'd be interested in doing what she's doing. Cause I'm doing this for her. She doesn't want to pay it. Like, she's late on her payments, whatever. And so, they were, again, doing kind of the least they could do to keep the vineyard going. And then, when we came in, the yields would go up, the quality would go up, and, things would get better, was kind of the idea there.
What draws you guys to a vineyard, aside from, I guess, being able to work with it, but either farming or purchasing the grapes? What gets you guys excited about a vineyard?
Yeah. I mean, I guess we'll take that a step at let's talk about the farming first. That's more, we look at region, kind of vine age, soil types, that kind of thing, is what we're interested in, primarily, and then I'd say the variety is kind of, I don't know, second, I think, just because there's so much Pinot, Chardonnay, Cabernet, Zinfandel planted that we've learned that if you want a specific variety, you're not going to find it, generally from vineyards that you're leasing. And so for us, I think, I like to think of it like that should not be the least important thing, but I think the first thing I want when you taste our wine is to be like, oh, this wine is dynamic, it's alive, and it's full of energy. And that should be the first thing you notice. And then after that, then you start thinking about, where is it from? What is the variety? What is whatever? And so it should have that energy. So like whether it's Cabernet or it's Zinfandel or it's, Trousseau Gris or whatever, it should have that vibrancy, and that's what we're striving for when we farm the grapes. And then again, I think vine age, to an extent, some of the vineyard health. I mean, if there's been some vineyards that you're like, this is too far gone. And it wouldn't be that interesting. I think, it's like, I mean, I think there's a lot of vineyards that do have potential. There's one or two that and it's funny too, because you don't really, really know until you start making wine from it also.
Right. Okay. That's a good point.
And so we used to kind of say yes to a lot of stuff. And there was one vineyard that like great views, like soil seemed really interesting, everything, but just the wine never turned out very good. And so we're like,
okay.
And the property sold and this and that. And we're like, okay, we're just going to like be done with this. You know? But yeah, I think, and then to an extent now, we're a bit like, if there's a half acre or something, it's like, I can't do this either.
Sure.
We've gotten to the point where that's a little tough, but I think that we tend to look for older vines and then in somewhat cooler regions. So that area around Sonoma is a relatively cool area because it has a lot of influence from the bay.
Right.
And there's kind of a diversity of soil types too, which is nice because that allows us to make some different styles of wine. And then, again, to an extent, the vine health. And it's like, is it like, what's the reason for it being in decline? Because a lot of the vineyards that we have we take over aren't in the best shape. And you're like, well, is it because hasn't been fertilized and pruned properly? Or is it because like it's got a lot of eutypa and like wood disease and other problems that we can't necessarily help, so we'll look at that. And that's been, relatively good for us. I think, we've seen enough vineyards now, you can kind of see something and you're like, oh, this is a good idea or this isn't a good idea. And then also the owners too, since we don't own it, we'll meet them and kind of see, is this going to be a good fit? Do they get what we're doing? Like, will we have a good relationship? Because, again, because we don't own the land, like we've come in and out of a few different arrangements. Sure. And sometimes, because we're like, hey, we're going to farm organically. You live on the property. It's going to be better for your health. It's better for the animals, better for the environment, this and that. And they're like, oh, great. But then, they see weeds growing under the vines and they're like, you're killing my vineyard. Like, because there's weeds and you're like, no, like it's fine. Trust me, or like, oh, there's some shoots that aren't perfectly straight.
And canopy's a little not as perfect.
Yeah. And so then that is challenging because it's like for what we're doing too, again, I think there's a perception of, if you sell your wine for $100 a bottle or whatever, and you pay this much for grapes, then sure, it should look all perfect, right? But it's like, that's also not what we're doing. So there's a reality. I think it's both. It's like a little bit of benevolent neglect. I think, to me personally, I think it makes for a better product, but also like helps us not spend a bunch of money that isn't needed, and we really focus on, proper pruning, proper suckering, timing sprays right, and like the things that, and then fertilizing through compost and cover cropping. And it's like, how do we maximize the utility of our efforts and not waste energy with things that don't matter? And things that don't matter are perfectly lined shoots, leaf pulling like crazy, or having like no weeds growing, which a lot of those are actually detrimental to like the health of the vineyard too. In terms of buying grapes, again, that's another bit of a challenging thing to say. There's a recipe that we look for or something, but it's a lot of the similar stuff is, vine age, region, again, knowing the grower. I think fortunately for us, because we have so much experience farming vineyards, we can go in and see, oh, these are pruned properly. Oh, they're not suckered right. These shoots show this, that, and the other disease, or, other things. And that helps us to identify, I think like healthy vines and healthy soils and things like that. So that's a big thing for us. And then there we can be a little bit more choosy in terms of looking for great varieties and things like that. Okay. But, we're also interested in, again, the relationships with people. I mean, some of the growers we've worked with, it's going to be coming on 10 years now. Right. And so, we see what they have, because it also tends to be certain grapes from certain vineyards or grapes from certain vineyards do well almost regardless of the variety. It's like, okay, something else came available. Yeah, I trust that this is going to be good as compared to, again, we usually try out some things and it's like, oh, they don't work. And sometimes it's due to our style of winemaking too. Like we've tried making wine from Contra Costa County, like in the Brentwood area.
Okay. Yeah.
Which a lot of people have a lot of success for. And I think we're just like not good enough winemakers or we're too neglectful or something. Like our wines always end up being either mousy or like get VA we even had one Sauvignon Blanc that got all ropey.
Oh, that's really?
Like, that's syrup kind of. Which I'd never seen before.
Yeah, I've only heard about it. I've never actually seen it.
Yeah, and we ended up, dumping it down the drain and stuff. And it's like, I think there's a certain sturdiness to wines from Mendocino and also Sonoma and Napa that allows, or that we had kind of had our winemaking style. We rack the wines, we'll aerate them during the fermentation. And then this was almost like a completely other thing where like the wines were much more, I say fragile, and I mean that only as a pejorative in the context of our winemaking.
Okay.
Because we didn't, we top up the wines, but we're not like every 2 weeks on the button, like,
sure,
whatever. Because we're oftentimes busy doing stuff in the vineyard or installing drains in our winery or, all sorts of crap like that. And so we kind of learned, oh yeah, okay, this region, we've tried it enough times, like, we're avoiding that. And whether it's the soil type or the weather or I don't know what, but like it just doesn't make sense for us.
Yeah.
And so yeah, we've shied away from that,
Okay. What's your process with the grapes once it's time to pick? You're looking mostly at pH or sugar or
yeah. I mean, we look at both for sure. I think it was about 4 years ago or something we started tracking pH with our sampling.
Okay.
And that was, I think, really interesting for us because the sugar and the acid don't always track each other exactly. And it was a hard transition at first too, because it's kind of like, and this is something I always talk to Diego about, because it's like in those first years, now you have a new piece of information that you're trying to make decisions based off of, but we don't have any reference to what we were doing in the past. And so it's like, wait, the pH is doing this, but it could have done that last year, but we just didn't know it. And we're not letting this affect us. So, it's like you really have to remember that all these things are, indicators and they aren't some sort of truth. Right. But generally we have like some targets of bricks and pH that we're looking for. And we see, I wouldn't say there's like a specific target. It's more like a profile, so it's like if you see something moving in a certain way, then that gives you the confidence to let it go longer or something. Or, there's certain almost bookends too. It's like, okay, I don't want to make a wine that's 10% alcohol and I don't want something that's like 3.0 pH, but I also don't want to pick when it's like at 3.7 or 3.8 or something too, and I think that is interesting. It helps us inform our decisions, but of course you're tasting the juice and, working on that too. So
for reds, or do you destem most of grapes or more whole cluster or a little mixture of?
Definitely both. Yeah. I mean, we make enough wine where we kind of do all sorts of stuff. And then now also having this new facility, it gives us the freedom to actually be able to do that, which has been really good because in Orinda, we were very much maxed out in our space. And then we were doing some overflow production up in Sonoma.
Okay.
At a custom crush place, which, we always knew, like, it wasn't ideal, but we knew it was, we were on our path to trying to get our own place where we bring everything together. And we needed a certain amount of production to be able to justify that. And so we're like, okay, these few years while we're doing that, like, it'll help us continue to support our growers, help us like give our employees healthcare, pay myself, whatever, knowing that we're going to eventually land there. So there, you can do stuff, but you don't have as much. I mean, you can tell them what to do, but then, how much it's getting done or tasting, really being granular with the tasting. It's a little more challenging. And so this past year we had like complete freedom to be flexible and do everything. And so, yeah, we do a lot of destem, a lot of whole cluster, a lot of all sorts of things. It very variety dependent, the Bordeaux varieties, like I don't tend to like whole cluster. The tannins or the stems are very, very tannic and very green. We've tried that before and it was just like disastrous. And then I think we do tend to pick on the slightly earlier side. And so I'm wary of the stem tannins can be very drying. Okay. So on wines that we do longer aging, like over vintaged either in barrel or over vintage in bottle, we'll see some more of that because it gives the wine a little more time to resolve itself. But in the earlier released wines, they can still be tannic, but it's more of a fleshier, fruitier tannin, not fruitier, but like a rounder. It isn't quite as dry as the stem tannins. We do some of that, but we also will do a lot of either shorter macerations or this, we call it our reverse Saunier kind of style, where we blend back rosé juice into grapes, or carbonic maceration or things like that tend to lighten the wines. I don't know. I'm like a Northern Frenchman at heart. So I think Brie and like Trousseau, I'm like, oh, Trousseau, it's too tannic. Like it's not for me. I'm like a Pulsar guy. Like
I was going to ask you about the reverse Saunier method that you guys do, because you've been doing that for quite a while, and I want to know how you sort of came about that technique.
Let's see. So that, I always say this too, like, I'm sure there's no such thing as an original thought. There's like some Georgian person 10,000 years ago doing exactly what I was doing and whatever. But so the idea kind of came about, wanting to make a fresher wine, but not necessarily being a carbonic maceration.
Okay.
Because I feel like outside of Beaujolais, like you taste carbonic maceration and it's very, it marks the wine in a kind of a particularly strong way. And, is, I don't know, maybe less so, but I don't know, it's trendy or whatever. And it's like, oh, I can't do something that's popular. Like that'd be too easy. And so the idea was to blanket clusters with juice instead of CO2 gas. So then you wouldn't need to do like pump overs or punch downs. Like it would protect it, and you get like this kind of slow extraction. So, the thought really being like to be able to do a longer maceration while still having a light style wine. Again, we did some experiments. We didn't exactly have the right equipment in that we were trying to do it in some of our 1 ton picking bin fermentations. And we had some issues there, and we were getting a little bit too much of like the stem extraction. And so we started moving towards destemming and adding juice back to really great results. I think we really like how that works because, again, you get to go the full, when I say full maceration, I mean, you press the grapes at dryness. So it's usually about 2 weeks or something. And during the length of the fermentation, you extract tannins, but then they kind of will adsorb back onto the skins, go back out, they polymerize, more stuff's going on. And so there's definitely a distinct difference between like a short maceration and a reversé or this reverse Saunier style, in that I think the tannins are a little more maybe interesting and longer while still being light.
Okay.
Where short maceration does serve a nice purpose in that it's like a crunchy, like fresh, light wine. But I think the other one can be a little bit more interesting. And so, yeah, it was originally, independently invented. When I was working with Philippe Valette, he had another intern, this guy, Olivier Cohen, who makes wines down near Marseille.
Okay. And
he was about to install himself. His family was buying a piece of property that he could make grapes at. And we were talking about this. We're like, I don't look at Taval, like Eric Pfifferling or, the Langlois wines and other things. You're like, oh, these are really interesting. Like, what can we do and it not be carbonic maceration? And that was this idea kind of came about. And so he does a lot of that. To this day, we do some, there's this guy, I don't know if you follow his Substack, Not Drinking Poison in Paris.
Yeah.
This guy, Aaron
Mm-hmm.
Askoff.
Yeah.
So he had an article about, there's a term that he used is flottaison.
Okay.
So it's like this French term, which basically means to float the cap.
Okay.
And you float it with juice, you know?
Okay.
And so there's a whole, like, I don't know, group of folks in France doing different experiments with that and, you know, doing it and then, you know, separating the free run with the press run and, you know, these other things that are even more, you know, detailed and maybe sophisticated than what we're doing because we'll kind of throw everything together at the end of the day. But it's interesting. And I think it's a cool way to, again, I tend towards liking the less extracted wines. This guy, Philippe, that I worked for, he only made Chardonnay and it was like, that's all I ever need to drink is really awesome Chardonnay from Northern France. Like, and there's no tannins, there's no nothing like, you know, the idea that you need a bunch of tannins and like a big chunky wine to be ageable or interesting or complex is like totally false. You know, it's like you need ripeness, balance, and good energy, you know.
Have you guys been native fermentations from the start of Les Lunes?
For sure.
Pretty much. Okay.
Yeah. We've never used any yeast. So that's super important to us. Yeah. And that's, you know, I would say we land between the 10 and 20 parts of sulfur. You know, we kind of, the pendulum swings a little bit and we'll do some no sulfur bottlings. It's been a little bit since we're starting to do a little bit more. You know, again, we make some of the blends are big enough where you're kind of casting a wide net. And so when you have 50 barrels and 10 tanks going into a wine, like if one or two of them is kind of weird, like it can cause issues. And so we take a, you know, very measured approach to that. And I think, but we'll never put sulfur at the crusher and only we'll put small amounts, maybe starting after malolactic fermentation is done.
Okay.
Because I think you want to see that progression of the different, you know, native yeasts go through. And that's similar to like, we avoid using the, you know, the pied de couve or the starter.
Sure. Okay.
Because in a lot of ways, that's almost like inoculating. You know, you're putting a lot of the primary fermentation yeast and not giving those other ones the chance to
you're kind of missing going. those early ones that
you know,
die out.
Yeah, exactly. So we will, you know, if a fermentation like 4 or 5 days isn't really starting to take off, we're like, okay, this needs a little help, and like let's the early guys have had their chance and they're partying and like we don't want them to, you know, take over the party, so like let's intervene, quote unquote, and do that. But like it's not a prescriptive kind of thing.
Do you think the science background you kind of got at Davis helps you intervene less or make cleaner wines while intervening less? Yeah,
I mean, I think, you know, it kind of again goes back to, I think Davis, it teaches you how to be a scientist, how to observe, you know, take notes, how to look for, you know, control variables, like whatever, to the best that you can. And then, yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if it was Davis or just our personality or like, you know, the fact that I think we came up in a time where at once like young enough to not have grown up on, you know, the Burgundy and Bordeaux and Napa classics, but old enough where, you know, we were drinking a lot of Beaujolais and Ganavat and other stuff like that. That is, I almost think of it as like the canonical natural wine, like, you know, the people that were kind of, I guess, rediscovering natural wine, you know, in France. And I feel like very few of those producers were, you know, the strict zero sulfur. I mean, they were zero sulfur at the crusher, no yeasts, you know, very little intervention. But like when I was working for Julie, there was this guy, Jean-Claude Chanoudet, and he would have, they called it the microscope party.
Okay.
So it was every, I think, Wednesday, or I forget the day, but in his cellar, you'd come by, you bring a sample of your problem stuff, and he had a microbiologist with a microscope.
Okay.
So you come and you're like, oh yeah, this thing's going off or weird, and they look at it and say, oh, there's Clockera, like this non-Saccharomyces yeast.
Sure.
And then you come back, you come out of the little room, your head's hanging down, you're like, oh, I've got this problem. And then everyone's sitting around like, well, what can you do? And, there was certain stuff like, oh, this yeast is susceptible to alcohol. You're in the early stages. So if you blend in, 5% of your last year's wine into this tank, or you water the cap with it,
okay,
that will kind of kill off this yeast. And so that's an intervention, but you're intervening with your own wine. And I think there's a lot of ways that we try to, and that's informed by science, right? Or like, a scientific understanding of the process. And so I think we try to take steps like that. Like, we don't have the microscope, but like when you smell things or you see things happening, you're like, oh, okay, this needs to be warmed up, or this needs to be aerated, or this needs to be some of the, yeast from another fermentation needs to be added in. And these kind of small things, I think I like to call them as like course corrections.
Okay.
As opposed to like a full intervention. So we're not really, being heavy handed with yeast or sulfuring or enzymes or filtering or whatever, but it's like, yeah, how do you pump air through, let's pump air through the wine early in the process to, so the yeast can multiply, have thicker cell walls, and will go through fermentation better, especially in vineyards that we know tend to get stuck or have reduction or other issues like that,
Okay.
And so there's that. And then I think we, again, have certain ideas of, and everyone, it's all different, right? Like, ideas of where we want in terms of the, how do I say this in a politically correct way? The tastes of the wine we want to be in a certain way and not be too one way or the other, in terms of, volatility or microbial stuff or something, and I think an analogy that I use often is like, we're trying to capture an image of a time and a place. And when you intervene, you're kind of draining out color, so it's going towards black and white. So that's removing like a vibrancy or an energy from the image. But if you're having issues with microbial stability, VA, mouse, whatever, that creates like a blurriness to the image. And so it's our job to try, or my objective is to try and provide like the clearest picture. And so that may not be like the most, like if it's black and white, but crystal clear, like that's not, I didn't succeed. If it's vibrant in colors, but like completely blurry, I make it look cool, but like that's maybe not what I'm trying to do. And so you're trying to like turn those two dials and really trying to capture like the right balance between the two. And so ideally you don't need to touch the dials, but sometimes you need to by either, a little bit of air, racking at the right time, blending something, et cetera.
Yeah. Like just a little nudge rather than like a shove.
Yeah. And then we've even, we've started doing more analysis of our wines in kind of October, November, like post primary fermentation, more or less post malolactic. And if the malolactic is done, there's still some sugar, and we noticed that the fermentation curve was a little slow, that's a candidate, and maybe the VA is kind of high. We're like, hey, this barrel needs 10 parts of sulfur. Okay. If the malic's gone, there's still a little sugar, but the VA is not high, and it was like always going kind of slow. We're like, okay, let's see what this barrel, like, let's check it again in 2 weeks and see what's going on. And then, we take notes. And so like, we'll take into account maybe that one barrel had 10 parts. Okay. So now that's 10 fewer parts we need to add at bottling, or, we keep that into the idea of what we're going for. And we find that, again, that little nudge at that time will get the wine in the quote correct path. And then you don't have to intervene further with like a heavier sulfur add or chuck the wine or something. And we do throw out a good amount of wine. I mean,
Okay.
10% of the wine probably doesn't make it into bottle.
Okay.
Because it's either got too much VA or is reductive or something. We're always trying to minimize that, but like that's the ultimate like way to stop, from making bad wines. You just don't sell bad wine, right? Like we make plenty of bad wine. We just don't try and sell bad wine.
Yeah. Okay. You touched on it quickly at the very beginning, but how has climate change and things like that, how have those been affecting your vintages the last few years?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a obviously very important question. And it's one that I don't know, as someone whose livelihood relies on like agricultural stuff, like I probably have my head in the sand further than it should be, in that I feel like, not to sound like a climate denier or something, but it's like I think we're early enough in the problems where like we can continue to make good wines, like at least in my lifetime, like 2020, like there was fires, there was a pandemic, there was heat waves, there was all this shit, and we made wines that were okay, and you're like, okay, that's cool. Like you make rosé or you do something else or whatever. And so I think that'll continue to be true for some amount of time, and the wine style may change, but that'll still be there. I think things like when we actually start owning land and planting vineyards, that'll be a different question. I think in terms of varieties, how it's going to be set up for farming, to be probably more mechanized, because not only are there climate issues, there's also like, with labor and other things like that, like,
Sure.
To be able to pay someone a living wage, like doing handwork on vineyards, like I don't know if that's going to exist like in 20 years. And so without the cost of wine being super expensive,
Sure.
And I think that's another big question. And that's something we can kind of get back to in a second. But then, potentially looking at, I spent a lot of time talking with some of my professors. They were developing grape varieties that the majority, or it was like 99.9% vinifera DNA, but they inserted the like 3 genes that are powdery mildew resistant. So that would just immediately get rid of the need for 7 or 8 tractor passes every year, right. So it reduces labor costs, it reduces emissions, it reduces compaction, all sorts of things. And so I think it doesn't necessarily have a recognizable variety name because it's a new variety. How he was doing it was like, it's kind of like Pinot, it's kind of like Sauvignon Blanc, it's, most closely related.
Sure.
But I think things like that are interesting. There's a lot of talk about hybrids and other things as well, but I'm accustomed to vinifera wines too. And so that's probably, and I think California is well suited to grow those. So I would be happy to continue to do that. I think hybrids are great in regions that otherwise couldn't be growing vinifera stuff. And then I think, again, hopefully California will continue, as long as there is water, or if you can keep dry farming or using drought resistant rootstocks. Like grapes are relatively low in water usage if you're smart about it, and watering at the proper times, that you can do pretty well with small amounts of water, again, if you have the right soil type and the right whatever. And then hopefully, because just moving north like isn't necessarily always going to be an answer, because I feel like the weather patterns, it's not just like an even warming as you go up. It's like, it's just 2 degrees warmer. Things become more erratic. So there could be more spring frosts, more hail, more other stuff in what are now colder regions. Although, I mean, a lot of places have been doing better, in terms of Germany makes the vintage of the century every year now with their stuff.
Yeah. I guess it improves it for some. Well,
yeah. But yeah, I think, hopefully in 5 or 10 years, we would be able to have vineyards of our own. And I think there I would probably look towards, Clarksburg or Lodi or something that is far away from forests, like has reasonably adequate water supply. I mean, not, I wouldn't be planting, alfalfa or like lettuce or broccoli or something that needs like a ton of water, but, enough for vineyards. And then it's also relatively flat, so it can be mechanized. Because again, this issue with, what does labor look like and being able to properly pay people and stuff, and then also sell wine that is accessible, because I think for us, I mean, and our wines we've done, or a big effort of ours is to continue to make our wines accessible at a price point too to consumers, because I think everything's fine and dandy about organic growing and whatever, but if it costs $40 a bottle, like you're not actually affecting anything really. And it'd be great if the grocery stores were lined with wines like ours, as opposed to stuff that was big agro farms and whatever. So,
yeah, of course.
And so that happens with some sort of scale, and then that occurs with just operating as such and trying to be smart about things like how you make your labels, how you do your bottles, how you make the wine too, and how you truck the grapes, and all these things like go into trying to minimize, in a lot of ways, like the cost, and then the being more environmentally sound, like align in some weird way. You're like, because for us, I always, when I first started, I thought getting lightweight bottles, I was like, oh, that's going to cost more because they're like eco-friendly.
Oh, yeah.
But no, there's just actually less glass, so the bottles are cheaper, and you're like, oh, okay, this is great.
It's like, win-win.
Yeah, I'm like, so whenever I call the glass suppliers, I'm like, give me the absolute cheapest glass that you possibly have, the lightest weight bottle, and it's good,
Yeah.
And then like with us and our growers, again, we're trying to achieve a certain scale where, it's the same amount of diesel to bring down 2 tons of grapes is 10 tons of grapes. So, and it also costs us, we pay by the hour for a truck. So like, how do we fill up that truck with grapes and kind of minimize the impact of that, and like maximize like everything that we're doing, like to be more efficient,
Yeah.
So it's hopefully cheaper and better environmentally.
What was the idea behind at the beginning, I guess, splitting the Les Lunes and the Populis wines into sort of 2 different labels, essentially?
So Les Lunes, that's the stuff we farm. Populis is stuff we buy.
Okay.
That's like a very, view from space distinction. We will do a couple bottlings under Les Lunes of some grapes we purchased, but those are like, Larry has some like 100-year-old Carignan vines that we want to showcase as their own thing.
Okay.
Or Lunes has like, this certain kind of parcel that the Chardonnay tastes, is exceptional. And like, it's generally older, it's like kind of the oldest vines of the property, or a way to talk about the growers in a single vineyard sense, as opposed to like a blend as well. So, but primarily like, we're drinking this Astral blend. We have our Cosmic blend, a Cabernet, like those are from all the different vineyards that we farm. And then if we feel that the vintage in the vineyard justifies it, we'll do some single vineyard stuff from those as well. So that's kind of the distinction. When we first started, we didn't have enough surface of vineyards to farm to make more lighthearted Les Lunes wine. So they were all kind of more serious. And so there was kind of a serious and playful, but as we can't sell 40 acres worth of like barrel, 2 years in barrel, another year in bottle, like our warehouse would be full. So we're like, okay, let's make some kind of, and it's funny too, because someone would come to the cellar and we're tasting barrels, and like the wines tasted really good the first year, and we're like, don't worry, we're gonna wait till this wine tastes really old and like weird, and no one's gonna want to buy it. So so it's nice to have a more like kind of fruit and fresh expression of the vineyards that we farm as well.
Yeah, I mean, different wines for different occasions.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's a big thing for me. I mean, 5 or 6 nights out of the week, I'm drinking something light and fresh, and hopefully still, like, that doesn't mean it's you know, drinkability and complexity and depth like aren't mutually exclusive, right? Like I
Right.
hope that they are, but you know, something that's more primary fruit is like what I gravitate to on the regular. But then, yeah, Sunday, you know, you're roasting a chicken, you're like, oh
Mm-hmm.
yeah, okay, let's drink this like old bottle and
Yeah.
hang out with it and
Mm-hmm.
you know, be calm. You know, you're not
Mm-hmm.
stressed about what you got to do tomorrow. Or although I don't know if that ever goes away, but
Probably not.
yeah,
Probably not this time of year for you,
yeah.
I suppose. You've done one of the industry sessions.
Oh,
And
yeah.
you've also had kind of a mentorship for BIPOC and the
Yeah.
LGBTQIA mentorship in wine production, farming, paperwork, things like that. I want to see if you could tell me a little more about that, how it came about.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think so many people have offered us the opportunity to learn from them, have helped us out. And I think a lot of those opportunities exist, but you know, it's not always easy, or people don't necessarily know that that's there, you know, and I'm privileged in being able to be in the position, you know, and have the confidence to say, hey, let me write this producer even to visit or to work for them or whatever. And so it was, you know, in the summer of 2020, during the George Floyd protests and things, it was like, and I think that was a time where, and hopefully continues to be a time, you know, or hopefully still continues to be, you know, something that we think about is like, oh, what are we doing? And what's performative and what's not. And, you know, it's like that whole black square debacle thing. People are like, oh, this is bullshit and whatever. And it was like, well, what actually could help make some sort of difference? You know, it was like, what do I have to offer? It's like, oh, I know things about running a wine business. And it's like, let's make it, even though that's always been open. And like, I have people have reached out to me and I'll help them and talk them through stuff and whatever. It's like, let's make it explicit that that is there. And like, you should reach out and be a little bit more, explicit and organized about it too. And so kind of put out a call and there was a great response. You know, I think we ended up talking to, I don't know, 25 or 30 people or so.
Wow, that's great.
And it continued, you know, some folks, I mean, even to this day now have their own business and stuff like that, you know, not like very much on their own accord and like being awesome, amazing people, but it's really cool to have seen that and to have been able to, you know, provide some materials that hopefully help assist in some small way towards what they're doing, you know? And I mean, I think the opportunity for people to reach out still 100% there. You know, we haven't explicitly advertised that, you know, in a minute, but it was really cool to do that. There's a guy out and he's now lives in France, is making wine. There's a woman in Vermont that started her own worker co-op, which is actually really cool. I saw her just this past spring.
Okay.
And I was like, how'd you set that up? Like, what's this about? And then, you know, because I think that's the thing. And this is, you know, hopefully what's really great and valuable about mentoring people is, you know, you end up learning a lot through the experience as well. Because, you know, it's someone who has either a different background or different experiences or has different ideas of what they're trying to do than what you're doing, which is great. And that's the point of everything. And you're like, okay, let me tell you how I did things. Hopefully you can take this and I'll do something either better or different or whatever. And then I'm now learning from them too, like this new kind of thing. So that's been super interesting, you know?
Yeah, it seems like a great program and really welcoming for other people that might want to get into the business and help find their way.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, that's always, you know, the folks that have worked for us too, we've always encouraged them to start making some wine also. And like, that's been pretty neat in that basically in our space, we provide that, you know, we're also in our space, we have room for other people to start kind of making wine within our facility too. And so like, I think it's definitely one of those rising tides and situations. And it's cool to have like a group of people together, working on their own things, but hopefully, helping everyone out and ideas and labor and fixing stuff and whatever. It's cool.
Yeah. Kind of going towards a common goal. How was it building a new winery in Richmond?
It is going. It's fun. I mean, I jokingly tell Diego, I'm like, well, I'm in my happy place now because it's now close enough to harvest where I'm like, don't talk to me about anything that isn't a construction project.
Okay.
So I'm like, I don't want to worry about like, compliance or this or that or whatever. And it's like, I'm being somewhat facetious, but also kind of not, like, don't ask me about the wine club email. Like, that's not what I'm doing. Like, I'm going to Home Depot. I'm doing this. I'm talking to contractors, So it's a lot, but I mean, I do like it, and it's something that's tangible and much more goal oriented than like, making wine. You're kind of always, it's always, is this going to work? Is it not? Are people going to like it? Am I going to like it? Like, I don't know, but you're like, there's drains in the ground. I accomplished this, is great. So actually my father was a contractor, well, he was a architect, contractor, and developer. So he kind of vertically integrated did everything. And so I grew up like, as soon as I could walk, I was, playing with the hammer and the saws and stuff like that, as a kid and helping on the job sites and things. So like, I have a good amount of those skills and like doing it. I think as a profession, I can see where, like every profession, you are dealing with people and that's annoying. And there's hard things about everything. I mean, it's like winemaking too. It's not just sitting on the porch watching the sunset and drinking wine, and so this is kind of like, I almost think of it as like my contractor pop-up that I get to set up at the winery, for 1 or 2 months out of the year. It's like that too. Like I, was always interested in cooking and like working in the back of the house, but I'm like, I absolutely don't want to run a restaurant.
It's fun to play with it.
It'd be fun. Yeah. It's like, oh, I'll do a dinner at the winery or like a bunch of stuff with friends or pop up somewhere or something. But like, you get to do that for a bit and like have fun with it without and feel, like let the stress be like invigorating and not like overbearing.
Yeah. Kind of get the good parts of it without any of the bad.
Well, even when the bad parts feel okay, if it's not too much, what I mean?
It's like the good kind of scared.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you and Diego, do you guys bring different things to the table with the winery?
Yeah. I mean, for sure. I think we've definitely found, some of our own like strengths, and have kind of specialized in certain ways. I mean, I think we're fortunate, it's coming out of the 10th vintage and like we've made it this long and, we're 50-50 partners, both the vineyards and the winery. And so like, I mean, it's hard to explain exactly, but like it works really well, the partnership, and it's like, we're both, in agreement or we know when to not fight about something, you know what I mean? But yeah, there's certain things, like I'm much more facilities, construction, logistics, that kind of stuff. And he helps a lot or takes the lead on, compliance, the accounting, like setting up certain organizational structures that like I wouldn't have done, but I'm like extremely grateful and thankful that we have that, inventorying the winery or like, when we first started farming the vineyards, he made a Google spreadsheet of everything. And every time you go to a vineyard, you got to put in what you do and how long it took. And so now we have historical data that we can look at and we're like, oh yeah, like this vineyard takes us, the past 7 years, it's averages 20 hours, an acre to prune and, 15 hours of sucker. And we sprayed it this many times. And it's like, it's very interesting and very, very helpful stuff in terms of projecting like, oh, should we farm a new vineyard? Do we have the bandwidth? Do we need to hire another person? Do we not? Like, does this make sense? Like whatever. And it's very super helpful because I think a lot of times, like I would, you know, you kind of fly by the seat of your pants, or you're like, oh, I'll figure it out. And you do, but then sometimes you end up beating your head against the wall or something. And so like, that's one aspect, not to be like, oh, Diego's a bean counter and he's only cares about this and that. And I'm just the free, like, it's not that at all, you know? And it's really helpful, I think, in terms of tasting wines and putting things together, is to have someone that you do it together and you can talk through stuff. So you're not just like in your head about it. And,
right.
You know, do I trust like this specific thing, or, you know, that I'm thinking, or is it just my mood's weird, or, you know?
Yeah. Here, taste this.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you also kind of need to, if you do disagree, then it's like, you need to justify your position and then convince someone why you're right, you know, or they do vice versa. And then you can know when to be like, oh yeah, I see the way you see it. And like, that's right. Or you find the middle ground between the two. And that's probably better than either one was.
Yeah.
You know, the thing how getting into natural wine too, like it always kind of felt right. And I think the funny story I tell a bunch is like, when I met my wife, I was in the wine program, and I was like, oh, hey, I'm in the wine program.
Yeah.
And she's like, yeah, that's cool. Like, wine's gross. I don't like wine, you know? Until I brought her to one of the wine tastings I was like in charge of the student wine tasting group. And we did like a Cru Beaujolais tasting. And she was like, oh, wow. Like, I didn't know wine was allowed to taste good. I thought like by default it was bad, you know? Okay. And then, because she liked it, and then I would joke that she had the best wine taste because she didn't have any preconceived notions of what wine was supposed to be like. And that's something that I struggled with when I first got into wine, because I studied chemistry in college, didn't want to become an academic, like, or work in a lab or whatever. You know, had ideas of working in a kitchen, but also knew I didn't want to do that. And got a job at a winery because it seemed to kind of blend all these things together a little bit. But I didn't know anything about wine. So I was like worried I was going to be a fraud. And so this was up in Anderson Valley. And the winemaker, I was like, you know, I'm trying to learn about it. He's like, you should just go wine tasting and taste stuff, you know, like take notes and whatever. Yeah. And I was like, cool. So I went to, you know, the first stop was like the fanciest place in Anderson Valley. And, you know, they have great landscaping, and the glass was nice, and the building and everything, and whatever. And they had the menu, and I had my little notebook. I was like ready to be a good wine student. And like, they gave me all these wines, and I was smelling them, and I was like trying to write down what it tasted like. And I just wrote down ketchup because I thought it smelled like ketchup, but I was like, I like crossed it out, and I got all like flustered. And I was like, you're doing this wrong. Like, look how nice this place is. Like, these are nice wines. I'm like, you need to remember this is what nice wine tastes like. And I was like trying to train myself because I thought that's what you're supposed to do. Right. And I think that's what's great about with natural wine. People are like, I'm trying to do what I want to do, and like really just listen to yourself and like more of a gestalt. Like, so when I taste wines, I'm not trying to smell, does it smell like raspberries or blueberries or blackberries or whatever? It's much more broad stroke. Like, you taste with your whole body. Like, how's your mouth feel? How's your throat feel? How's your stomach feel? Like, what does the acid profile, does it go up or down? Or like, do you feel uplifted or down, you know, whatever. And it took like a few, you know, years to kind of unlearn the stuff that I learned, or I tried to teach myself in terms of wine tasting, which I think is an important thing. It's like, listen to yourself, and like, you have better taste than you think you do. Like, block out the noise. And I think that's what a lot of these wines are about, is they're vibrant, you know, energetic. And maybe that doesn't agree with you, and like, that's okay too. Like, you are allowed to not like things. And if someone likes it, like, that's okay. But like, again, just like, you have that confidence and like what you like, you know. And this, to me, this is like aligns with natural wines and stuff. And I think there's more of an openness to that rather than, Sancerre should be XYZ flavors and you can blind taste it because that's what it's supposed to taste like, and that really helped me as a wine drinker and also as a maker to, again, like to trust yourself more, which is a really, really hard thing to do,
Yeah, especially when you're starting out.
Yeah. And then I guess to plug, we have a wine club. You should go to the website. Great deals, etc. You get a newsletter that won't be written by me in the fall because I'm too busy doing construction. Or, a lot of great places in town. Ordinaire, Snail Bar, Bay Grape, Punchdown, Mijote, all the places. I'm afraid I'm going to leave people out. So
I saw one at Paul Marcus today.
Paul Marcus. Oh yeah. Really great wine shop. Great butcher shop there. Fantastic deals on pasta at Market Hall. I'll show you I get the 5-pound bags all the time. Yeah. Really good stuff. The lines are a little long, but what are you going to do?
Yeah. Thanks for listening today. Shaunt and Diego are making some great wines and adding another voice to the growing Richmond natural wine community. They work with a wide range of varieties, and their wines can be found in many smaller shops. As you can hear, they're really passionate about farming their own vineyards and work with long-standing growers that farm very thoughtfully. You can find their wines at leslunewine.com or populiswine.com or leslunewine on Instagram. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast, and feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you can tell your wine friends about the podcast too and help spread the word, I'd really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too. There's also now a Patreon set up if you feel like supporting the podcast monetarily to hopefully allow for more episodes, more travel, and to help defray some other costs. The link is in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.